What's going on, everyone? Kyle Yates here, the Fantasy Pros Football Podcast. Thanks for joining us. As always, you can find our brand new content every week at youtube.com/fantasypros, as well as on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and follow while you're there. Today, we kick off a new series highlighting the upcoming Thursday night football matchup. Let's get right into it. Each week moving forward, we'll be taking a look at the fantasy options in the Thursday night football matchup and giving our general thoughts on whether these players should be viewed as starters in your lineups or sits. For the purposes of this exercise, a starter is viewed as a top 30 option in running back rankings, a top 40 option in wide receiver rankings, and a top 15 option in quarterback and tight end rankings. Inversely, the sits are players that fall outside of that range. This week, we have the New York Giants and Washington football team facing off. At the time of recording, the Betting Pros consensus over-under is extremely low at 40.5, which means that Vegas doesn't anticipate a whole lot of points going up on the board. However, there are certainly still some fantasy relevant options that we can talk about. Let's take a look at the New York Giants side of the football. Quarterback, Daniel Jones. Daniel Jones' numbers from last week look alright on a surface level, but his rushing touchdown came on the literal last play of the game when the defense wasn't particularly trying. Against Washington's top-tier defense that should absolutely wreck the Giants' offensive line, Jones isn't even on the radar in two QB formats. He can be viewed as a QB3 this week. SAQUON Barkley, running back. Barkley totaled 13 touches in week 1 as he worked his way back from injury, and he showed off his explosiveness and lateral quickness on a couple of occasions. However, he had very little room to run with the offensive line woes and the stout Broncos defensive line. He has another very tough matchup here again this week, so he'll need to see an uptick in work to even put himself on the redraft radar. At the time of recording, Barkley is still getting in limited practices, which doesn't bode well for his Thursday night football outlook. If I can, I'm looking to sit him one more week, and he is likely to fall outside of the top 24 running backs in my rankings. Kenny Golladay came back last week and performed quite well in a tough matchup against the Denver Broncos secondary. He made a couple of very difficult grabs in tight coverage and was able to bail out Jones on a couple of occasions. Even though he wasn't a fantastic option for fantasy purposes, it's encouraging to see him get back on the field and look like the Golladay we saw in Detroit. With that being said, this is another tough matchup for opposing wideouts, and Golladay is going to have to be incredibly efficient with his opportunity again. He can be viewed as a wide receiver 3 that has some upside if Jones and him can connect for a score. He can be in your starting lineup this week. Sterling Shepard, wide receiver. Last week, there weren't any Giants wide receivers I was willing to go near for fantasy, and Sterling Shepard proved me wrong. He came out and put on a show against some very good corners for 113 total yards and a score. With Kadarius Toney failing to step into a larger role just yet, Shepard's a very safe and reliable option for fantasy purposes. We shouldn't be viewing him as anything more than a flex option just yet, but he should see enough volume to easily return that value against the Washington secondary. He falls just outside my top 40 wide receivers on the week. Darius Slayton, wide receiver. Darius Slayton was able to hit 65 receiving yards in week 1, which will certainly work for fantasy purposes, but he did it on only 3 receptions. His usage in this Giants offense isn't secure enough to the point where we can rely on him as anything more than a boom or bust flex play. If we're assuming Jones struggles again in this one as a passer, we shouldn't be looking to start Slayton here. He's a sit for me. Kyle Rudolph, tight end. It appears as though Evan Engram's unlikely to suit up again for this game due to the short week. We might see him back in week 3, but he still won't be on the redraft radar then. Kyle Rudolph will step in as the starting option again this week, but he's not someone worth considering for fantasy purposes this week due to the matchup. Now let's move on to the Washington football team. Quarterback, Taylor Heinicke. Ryan Fitzpatrick is going to miss some time after suffering a hip injury, which puts Taylor Heinicke in here as a starter for Washington. The Giants surrendered 264 passing yards to Teddy Bridgewater in week 1, and with Washington's receiving weapons, Heinicke certainly could hit around the same mark this week. However, there are certainly better options you can look at in 1 QB formats, while Heinicke shouldn't be viewed as anything more than a low-end QB2 in Superflex leagues. Antonio Gibson, running back. While Antonio Gibson didn't put up dominant numbers from a fantasy perspective, it's extremely encouraging to see that he logged 23 total touches against the Chargers. The Los Angeles run defense didn't exactly figure to be an easy matchup either, so fantasy managers shouldn't have been expecting a blow-up performance. He was still featured in this offense though, and he should be relied upon heavily this week with Heinicke in at quarterback. Additionally, the usage of JD McKissic and Jarrett Patterson, only 3 total touches in week 1, is extremely encouraging for Gibson's managers. Gibson has a tougher matchup against the Giants on paper, but they just allowed Melvin Gordon to average 9.2 yards per carry on them. Gibson should see north of 20 touches again this week, and he deserves to be viewed as a top 12 running back again in week 2. Otherwise, JD McKissic and Jarrett Patterson shouldn't be considered for your fantasy lineup. Terry McLaurin, wide receiver. Fantasy managers were panicking a bit throughout the first half of week 1, but Terry McLaurin was able to salvage his fantasy output in the second half and put up a decent stat line. In a difficult matchup against the Chargers secondary, McLaurin didn't figure to be a top-tier fantasy option, but his talent was on full display on a couple of instances in that game. Lining up against the Giants secondary, McLaurin should be a safe option again this week, but his upside might be capped due to the quarterback play. He can be viewed as a mid-range wide receiver 2 for this matchup. Otherwise, there's not another Washington wide receiver that should be considered for fantasy purposes. Logan Thomas, tight end. Logan Thomas didn't end up with high reception totals in week 1, but he was able to find the end zone and subsequently vault up the fantasy tight end weekend rankings. The Giants weren't able to eliminate Noah Fant from last week's matchup, and he was able to reel in 6 catches for 62 yards. Thomas should be a safe option this week that has upside as well. He can be viewed as a mid-range to low-end tight end 1.